Hi there, and welcome to Ghostly Trails. I'm Robin Charlbury, and tonight I'm taking you on a journey into the world of spook and shiver. There is a chilling tale of an exorcism at Bampton Manor House, an imposing 18th century building that was built on the site of an earlier farmhouse. The residents of the house were troubled by a shadowy poltergeist, and so they enlisted professional help from a religious figure to perform an exorcism. It was common practice to summon the restless spirit in question and then trap it in some kind of vessel. Some of you may remember the story of the Tanfields in Burford, who were coaxed into a bottle and buried in the river Windrush after their flaming chariot terrorized the town. They threatened to reappear when the river ran particularly dry. Something to think about in 2022, during the driest summer in living memory. Here, however, the unusual container used to trap the spirit was a barrel of beer. Rather than dispose of the barrel, the family chose to keep it below the house in the cellar, where it apparently stayed for donkey's years. As the location of the barrel has now been lost to the mists of time, somewhere a troublesome spirit could be awaiting its release. Perhaps this place is in danger of being overrun with spirits. There is another legend surrounding the church in Bampton, behind me. If you want to know who in the village is going to die in the next year, it's possible to find out by coming here to St Mary's Church at midnight on October the 31st. If you wait by the church's west doorway, you will witness a procession of all the elderly and sick people in the village slowly making their way into the church, apparently vanishing through the closed door. Not long after, they will re-emerge from the church, only this time, only those that would survive the next 12 months will reappear. If you are unlucky enough to see your loved ones enter the church, but fail to reappear, you will know their time on earth is coming to an end. I think I'll make arrangements to be on holiday that week. We journey a few miles north to the ancient market town of Witney. At number 46 High Street, the old grey tulip-listed building is said to be haunted by the sounds of footsteps coming down the stairs. In the 1930s, the place was turned into a music shop, and it was the manager, Ken Cook, who first reported the supernatural sounds. It seems this can be attributed to a ghost from a few decades before. It had once been the premises of the Gas, Coal and Coke Company, and the manager at the time, one Mr. Lovell, defied his own name and, whilst living on the floor above the shop, took his own life. Subsequently, several guests in the building, who had no knowledge of Mr. Lovell's tragedy, reported hearing the sounds. Mr. Cook decided to take matters into his own hands. Standing confidently at the bottom of the stairs, he loudly requested Mr. Lovell kindly vacate the premises, and from then on, the haunting stopped. Until the 1990s. The building had become a branch of Unwin's wine shop, and the manager, David Parsons, reported hearing the same sounds that Mr. Cook had heard. Had Mr. Lovell's ghost returned home, or had he been there all along? On the other side of the town, just next to St Mary's Church, once stood the Bishop's Palace, a large 12th century manor house. It was the second home of the Bishop of Winchester and hosted a whole range of royal visits. It was pulled down in 1751. Mount House was built on the site, and it is around here that a royal ghost has been spotted in the form of Queen Emma of Normandy. She was the wife of King Athelred the Unready, and Witney is proud of the strong connections with her. There is a street named Queen Emma's Dyke, and of course Queen Emma's Primary School. She was a strong-willed woman, and often unpopular in court, wielding significant influence over her son, Edward the Confessor. The Bishop of Winchester was also a close adviser to the king, and saw Queen Emma as an obstacle to his power. He accused her of what he called unchastity, and she underwent a terrifying ordeal by fire at Winchester Cathedral to prove her marital commitment. Much to the surprise of the bishop, Queen Emma breezed through the trial, stoically walking across burning hot ploughshares on the floor of the cathedral nave without any apparent problem. She was thus proven innocent, and King Edward, hugely relieved at the result, granted 21 manors to the bishop, including the one in Witney where the Queen built his palace. The ghost of Emma has been spotted drifting across the grounds of Mount House in broad daylight, a tall, willowy figure wearing Norman period clothing. Since as far back as the 11th century, every year a large procession celebrated the Easter religious holiday, moving through the town and across the River Windrush. Various effigies and puppets representing biblical figures were carried aloft, and a great time was had by one and all. However, what started as a religious ceremony organised by the church soon became more of a rowdy celebration. It attracted more and more people who attended the event more to drink and make merry than to celebrate the rebirth of Christ. And as a result, the church decided to ban the procession. This did not go down well with the locals, who looked forward to the processions each year. The following Easter, a drunken mob formed in the town and threatened to destroy the bridge over the Windrush if the church did not lift their ban. It seems a young and inexperienced priest confronted the mob, attempting to stop the rabble from any precipitous action. The mob saw this as the church digging its heels in, and the novice priest was flung from the bridge, where he drowned in the rushing waters of the river. Legend has it that if you go to the bridge on the third evening after Easter and look down into the water, you will see a phantom drowned cleric floating face down in the water as it passes beneath the bridge. We move west now to the small village of Minster Lovell, just outside Witney. These oddly beautiful ruins stand beside the wonderfully clear River Windrush, and next to the nearby church of St. Kenelm. Both are well worth a visit. Within these ruins, strange groans have been heard, echoing eerily around the place. This would have been a very grand house. It was built in 1430 by the Lovell family. Lord Lovell was a figure of mystery, enjoying prosperity as King Richard III's confidant. However, in 1485, after Richard was defeated by Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth, Lovell became a wanted man. Subsequently, he seems to have disappeared completely from the history books. Perhaps there's a sinister connection in the wailing heard for centuries around Minster Lovell. When the Wars of the Roses were over, Lovell fled back to the Minster and hid in a secret vault. He gave his servant the only key, charging him to look after his well-being and safety. Unfortunately, the servant died shortly afterwards, and no one was left to tend to Lord Lovell, with, apparently, the inevitable result. It is said that a few hundred years later, in 1708, a skeleton was discovered in the ruins of the house, surrounded by mouldy books and the skeleton of a small dog. Could this be the mortal remains of the ghoul who wails in the small hours of the morning? I suppose it's possible. But there is another earlier tale from Minster Lovell. A woman dressed in white has been spotted wandering around, climbing a long-since-vanished staircase in the main hall. The story goes that the lady in white suffered the same horrible fate as Lord Lovell himself. Many years ago, it was customary for a bride to be kidnapped by the groom's friends and taken to the church. The girl was expected to appear to try and evade her kidnappers in a game of hide-and-seek. She would eventually be found by the young men, and after much merriment the game would be up. On this occasion, however, the fun and games turned into tragedy. The bride-to-be hid inside an oak chest in the attic, the lid of which clicked shut, tragically sealing her doom. No one heard her calls for help, and the hiding place would become her premature coffin. It was many years before she was discovered, a skeleton in a tattered wedding dress. Some say that it is her groom, William, who wanders the precincts of the Minster Lovell Hall, searching for his bride, wailing sadly into the night sky. In the village, the White Hart Inn is said to be haunted by the ghost of a Victorian woman who committed suicide after a broken love affair. She can be seen silently weeping as she wanders the passages. Poltergeist activity has been reported, glasses disappearing, barrels being knocked over, and the bar's bell ringing of its own accord. Perhaps this Victorian woman was a bit of a showwoman. Before we head to Burford, familiar of course to Cotswold Explorer viewers, we take a small detour just south of the A40 to Bry's Norton. It was here that in 1937 a haunted wardrobe was sold at Carterton Manor. For sale, haunted wardrobe. Advertiser will be glad to deliver same to anybody interested, complete with ghost, which would also no doubt feel more at home if welcomed, wrote Mrs. B. Barclay, Carterton Manor, Oxon. So read the advertisement, placed in London's Morning Post on August the 19th, 1937. Mrs. Barclay relates that she acquired the wardrobe some 3 years earlier at an estate sale in Berkshire, but it was since its installation in her house that it had become troublesome. Even if the wardrobe doors were tied shut, they would open and close of their own accord. Knocking echoed through the house, and on one occasion the wardrobe mirror was smashed after the door violently flung itself open. The figure of an elderly man was once seen by Mrs. Barclay, her brother, and her secretary, leaving the wardrobe, apparently kicking the butler in the shins as he went. Mrs. Barclay's staff opted to leave their jobs rather than continue facing assaults from this phantom, and after she was forced to camp outside one night in order to get any sleep, she decided it was time for the wardrobe to go. The advertisement caused wide interest, and she eventually sold it to a Mr. Rundle, the landlord of an inn near Clamfield, just a few miles up the road. He didn't believe in ghosts, so was unfazed by the stories, but it wasn't long after it was installed in his home that he reported strange occurrences. The wardrobe shook and rattled of its own accord, and banging sounds were heard from inside, just as it had done when first installed at Carterton Manor. In order to avoid further trouble, he dismantled and reassembled the wardrobe, apparently stopping the trouble for good. Despite the ghostly problems, or just possibly because of them, Mrs. Barclay had bought the wardrobe for £10 and sold it for £50, making a tidy sum for her trouble. It's difficult to pinpoint where exactly Carterton Manor stood. Perhaps it wasn't really a manor house, more a farmstead. But heading out of the village, we pass an area known as the Stonelands. And this area has a sinister reputation from the 18th and 19th century in connection with the horrific practice of baby farming. This terrible activity involved providing unfortunate women who had fallen pregnant unintentionally with a place to lie in and give birth, then removing the baby and raising it on behalf of those parents, for which a small amount of money changed hands. No adoption agency, this. These baby farmers exploited the children as slave labor. Any youngsters who were too weak or frail to work were rumoured to have been disposed of. Sadly, some of these rumours really do ring true. Here at Stonelands, the Swan Leys Great House once stood, peculiarly as a result of a clerical error, not registered as a building in any of the surrounding parishes, and therefore free to develop infamy as a place where babies were exchanged and natal care of the extremely shady kind were advertised, without any parish oversight. A phantom woman haunts the site of the house, and when passing along the nearby road you may catch a glimpse of a spectral lantern moving around in the garden. The consensus appears to be that this is the ghost of a child murderer reenacting the burial of her victims. Moving west, we take the A40 trunk road towards Burford. Before this dual carriageway was built, the main road between Witney and Burford was the B4047. It's along this stretch of road near Astle that a ghostly highwayman has been spotted, nicknamed Black Stockings by the locals. He's been seen on both horseback and on foot, and one theory suggests he is one of the Tom, Dick and Harry Dunstan brothers, infamous highwaymen, well known for targeting Burford in their notorious robberies. The beautiful village of Astle has a particularly strange story involving the ghost of... Two separate accounts detail two people that met a gypsy-like girl on the road near Astle Manor. On a dark October evening, a driver passing through the village spotted a girl with dark shoulder-length hair, olive skin, and a gypsy-like appearance, who flagged him down, climbed into the passenger seat, and sat in silence. The driver told of how the girl was soaked through, and when he asked her if she was all right, she replied, "It's too late, he's gone," before vanishing before the driver's eyes. On the second occasion, on an afternoon in March, when a young mother was on her way to collect her son from school, she saw a young girl trying to flag her down. She stopped and let her in. As the young, drenched girl climbed in, she said, "You got my message, then?" The driver asked what the girl meant, and she answered, "The water, the river, he's gone," and again vanished. No one seems to have found any explanation for these peculiar encounters. Nobody has managed to connect the phenomena to any real-world events. The girl's soaked condition and her mention of the river could indicate some tragedy at the nearby River Windrush, but there is no further information to go on. Continuing on, fortunately with no phantom hitchhiker in tow, we pass through Swinbrook. The bridge that crosses the River Windrush here is said to be haunted by the ghost of a woman in 15th century clothes, carrying a bundle. She looks frail and distressed as she crosses the bridge, pausing in the middle before vanishing into thin air. We now enter the famous Cotswold settlement of Burford. The magnificent church of St. John the Baptist, one of the largest in the region, is beautiful by day and night, and an essential visit for the Cotswold traveller. It is said that at night time, in the depths of the winter, the bells ring of their own accord. Apparently they are heard by many in the town and seem to emanate from the church, but whenever the bells are inspected, they're always unattended. It seems nothing can be done to quiet them, and the phantom bells are still heard by many locals. Perhaps there's a scientific explanation, or perhaps it's linked to a story we've told you previously at this church. During the Civil War, the church was used as a prison for over 300 mutinous Roundhead soldiers. By the orders of Oliver Cromwell, 3 of them were shot in the churchyard in front of their fellow soldiers to serve as an example. They were known as the Levellers. The bells are not the only haunting known in Burford. The ghost of a man with a rifle has been sighted, sometimes stopping to take aim as if to fire, much to the alarm of the witnesses, who presume themselves to be his intended target. A ghostly monk is also said to wander the churchyard, as well as the neighbouring rectory. In the 17th century, Lord and Lady Tanfield came to Burford. They lived in Burford Priory, a beautiful medieval building that had been converted from a priory into a private home. Lawrence Tanfield rose so high in society that in 1603 he entertained King James I at the priory. Lawrence and his wife were disliked by many in the town. If he was a difficult person to like, his wife Elizabeth was harsher by far. She considered the townsfolk entirely inferior. At one point, she is quoted as saying, "I'd like to grind the people of Burford to powder under my chariot wheels." There are also tales of Lord Tanfield cheating his neighbours. All in all, the pair were universally loathed. In 1625, after a long life of squeezing the townspeople dry, Sir Lawrence died, and Elizabeth followed shortly afterwards. The locals breathed a great sigh of relief, but Tanfield-free life was short-lived. Such strong characters are seldom expected to rest quietly. After their deaths, the spirits of Lord and Lady Tanfield returned to terrify their neighbours. On the darkest of nights, it is said they would ride their fiery chariot over the rooftops of the town with loud cackling and terrifying shrieks. For years the people lived in fear as the haunting continued. By the 18th century, the locals were so fed up with this phantom chariot, they decided something had to be done. 7 clergymen were summoned to lay the malevolent spirits to rest. After a long chase, the clergymen finally drove the pair to the churchyard. Unfortunately, this was where they were at their strongest. At the east end of the church, in the chapel of St. Catherine, looms their huge, colourful tomb, with their hard-faced effigies upon it. The clergymen didn't want this to be their last resting place, and they managed to force them into a bottle. Clutching this bottle with all the strength and willpower they could summon, they dashed down to the bridge over the River Windrush and hurled the bottle into the depths of the river. There it stayed, the spirits finally at rest. The town of Burford could sleep soundly at last. It is said that should the River Windrush ever run dry under the first arch of the bridge, the Tanfields will rise again to torment the town. For many years, the town remained in peace until, in one particularly dry spell at the turn of the 20th century, it became so unusually hot that the river ran down to a trickle, and the puddles beneath the bridge, where the bottle had sunk, began to hiss and bubble. It was as if the Tanfields were making their way back from hell. The townsfolk acted promptly. So desperately were they to keep evil spirits from rising again, they formed a bucket chain from upriver to make sure the spot didn't dry up completely. And to this day, the Tanfields have never risen again. Who knows? Maybe one day another heat wave will bring the Tanfields back to life. Many years ago, a Reverend George W. Underwood had just moved in to begin his tenure at the beautiful church of St. John the Baptist. His wife was upstairs one day in the rectory when a visitor arrived. The guest was shown into the drawing room by a servant, who then went upstairs to inform Mrs. Underwood that she had a guest. When she came downstairs, the drawing room was empty. She looked around the rest of the house and garden and found nothing. The visitor had vanished. Mrs. Underwood's servant described the woman as wearing a brown dress with a peculiar, somewhat forbidding face. Friends of the Underwoods, after hearing this description, realized that it matched the description of a Mrs. Thorpe, the wife of a previous vicar, Reverend John Thorpe. Mrs. Underwood's mind, whilst confused, at least was put at rest, until it was explained that Mrs. Thorpe was not only long dead, but that she had a sinister reputation. It seems some children under her care had gone missing in extremely mysterious circumstances. Could the ghost of Mrs. Thorpe have returned to the scene of her crimes? We leave Burford now and head north, passing through Shipton under Wychwood. A room at Shipton Court was haunted by a ghost so persistent that the haunted room was sealed up after it was exorcised. The precise location of the room is unknown, and there are no further details to the story. A woodland near Idbury to the northwest is said to be haunted, and a ghostly monk has been spotted at Bruin Abbey. At Langley, a few miles away near Leafield, a royal hunting lodge was thought to be haunted by a ghostly woman in a state of terrible anguish. Whoever she was, it seemed she was connected with an underground passage that the resident had recently opened up. Once the passage was closed up again, she was never seen again. Heading up the Burford Road towards Chipping Norton, along the way we pass Lynham Longbarrow, which is home to a peculiar story. One pitch-dark night, a man was walking home from Chipping Norton to Burford. As he was passing the Longbarrow, he felt, rather than saw, another man come up alongside him. They walked and talked together, covering some distance until they passed a cottage, where a woman stood outside carrying a lantern. Grabbing the opportunity to see his travelling companion in the light, our hero glanced round, only to find, to his astonishment, that his fellow walker was carrying his own head under his arm. As soon as the headless figure realized he'd been spotted, he vanished into thin air. Let's now take a brief detour down Pudlicote Lane. Here, a legend tells of an old lady known by all as Gran, who was believed to live in a cave at the nearby quarry. Despite her humble and unorthodox accommodation, it was said she possessed a hoard of gold sovereigns, buried somewhere in the quarry. A ghostly figure has been spotted many times at the road junction. Now known as the White Lady, she is believed to be Gran, searching for her stash of gold. Now to Chipping Norton, to the Church of St. Mary the Virgin. This lovely old building originates largely from the 12th century, but our ghost story seems to have happened in the year 1549. The country was suffering an economic decline at the hands of Edward VI, Lord Protector Edward Seymour, which prompted a reaction from the people, referred to later as the Oxfordshire Rising. Legislation leading to the enclosure of public land and amendments to the Anglican Church by the introduction of the new Book of Common Prayer fanned the flames, and before long a rebellion was gathering momentum. The vicar of St. Mary's, Chipping Norton, Henry Joyce, joined the rising, apparently because the Chantries Act had left him more than 800 parishioners to minister for entirely on his own. In mid-July, a mercenary force of German and Swiss soldiers under the command of William Grey, 13th Baron Grey de Wilton, were dispatched to extinguish this resistance, and the mob was dispersed at Enslow Hill. Around 200 people were taken prisoner, including the ringleaders, one of whom was Henry Joyce. It was decided to make an example of these ringleaders, and they were returned to their respective towns to be executed publicly on market day. Their heads were to be set at the highest point available for the more terror of the said evil people. And so Henry Joyce was strung in chains from the church tower in Chipping Norton, a deterrent to the other rebels. Joyce's ghost has been witnessed many times, haunting the site of his execution. Leaving Chipping Norton, we head over to the border near the famous Rollright Stones. It seems that as early as Tudor times, the Rollright Stones served as a meeting place for witches, but we think they were used much earlier than this, with some speculating that the stones exude some kind of ancient power of pagan origin. One tale tells of the murder in 1875 of one Mrs. Tennant from Long Compton, the village just below the stones, who, having been accused of being a witch, was subsequently murdered. The murderer was James Haywood, who, believing he had been bewitched by Mrs. Tennant, took her life. It seems that Mrs. Tennant kept toads in her garden, and Haywood saw this as evidence of her witchcraft. He was arrested and imprisoned for life in Warwick Jail, where, believing himself still to be under the influence of Mrs. Tennant, he died slowly, refusing all food and water. Many say he may have been deeply influenced by a traditional local saying, "There are enough witches in Long Compton to draw a wagon-load of hay up Long Compton Hill." Another strange tale of these ancient stones involves any attempt to move or cause damage to them. A man from Banbury was said to have chipped off a piece of one of the stones, and with the shard in hand he attempted to leave in his horse and cart. The wheels were locked solid, preventing him from moving. Another time a soldier is said to have chipped a piece from one of the stones. He took it to India, and shortly after his arrival died of typhus. It shows the strength of the tendency of the locals to blame everything on witchcraft, that a man killed of a disease halfway round the planet was thought to have brought it on himself on a hill above Long Compton. In another eerie incident, a local farmer from Little Rollright wanted to build a bridge over one of his streams. He inspected the stones, and it seemed to him that a capstone from the Whispering Knights would serve his needs. It took 20 horses to haul the stone downhill, and 2 men were apparently killed in the process. Nevertheless, the farmer persevered, and the capstone was placed across the stream, forming the clapper bridge he so desired. But trouble ensued. Late that night, strange, unearthly sounds emanated from the stone, and in the morning he found the stone not laid over the stream as intended, but up on the bank. This was persuasion enough for him to return the stone to its rightful place. It took only 1 horse to haul the stone back up the hill, a sure sign
that this was where it belonged. The Rollright Stones are a haunting place to visit. It is said one can never accurately count the number of stones that make up the King's Men, but I would certainly invite you to try.
Taking the A44 back past Shipping Norton towards Woodstock, we pause in the village of Enstone. A Victorian tale here tells the story of the Hall family, who seemed to be chased by poltergeist activity wherever they went. Thomas and Anne Hall lived at Little Tew, Thomas working as a blacksmith, when inexplicable sounds began to haunt them. Cutlery rattling in the cupboards, cocks crowing and so on. It became so troublesome that they decided to move to Hook Norton. But the strange sounds continued to plague them. On one occasion, Anne Hall was in bed when she heard the sound of groaning coming from her pillow. She stabbed the pillow with a penknife, and alarmingly, blood appeared on the pillow. In their efforts to escape the supernatural disturbances, they moved to Enstone, but the trouble only continued. Thomas was hampered by an invisible force in his work as a blacksmith, causing him to miss hammer strokes when working metal. A neighbour named Jeffries, who was a friend of theirs, would often visit, and he saw for himself more strange occurrences. Fire irons would move at their own accord in the sitting room, and a disembodied voice would ask for a plate at dinner time. Anne explained that the voice had to be appeased, and so an extra plate was placed, or else there would be no peace. The most sinister occasion was during another of Geoffrey's visits, when the sound of a gunshot came from outside the house, accompanied by the sound of a bullet ricocheting off the table. Upon inspecting the door and the table, no mark or hole could be found. The Halls stayed in Enstone for the rest of their lives, but whilst history doesn't actually relate if their troublesome poltergeist persisted, perhaps they simply learned to live with their supernatural companions. We are now bringing our journey to a conclusion, zigzagging to our final destination, Woodstock. We first passed the Horse Stone, and rather like what we found at the Rollright Stones, this stone is said to go down to the village pub for a drink on Midsummer's Eve. Continuing south, the road between Charlbury and Finstock is said to be haunted by a phantom coach and four. Usually, only the sounds of horses' hooves and clattering wheels can be heard, roughly following the route of the B4022. It sometimes deviates from the road, probably because modern alterations have changed the road's course over the years. On one occasion, a party from Charlbury, attempting to get to the bottom of this phenomenon, decided to block the ghostly coach by barricading the road. They waited for some time before the unmistakable cacophony of the coach approached, but they saw nothing. To their astonishment, they heard the coach stop abruptly, pause briefly as if in consideration, and then they heard the sound of it turning around and setting off back for Charlbury. Triumphant that their experiment had worked, the party removed the barricade. But their satisfaction was short-lived, for as they were packing away the last remnants of the barricade, the unmistakable sound of the coach came clattering back down the road, passed by them, and carried on towards Finstock. Another account tells of a mother and son out walking when they heard the infamous sound approach. They paused to let the phantom pass, but to the mother's surprise, the sound of the coach slowed and stopped. Her son pointed in the direction of the noises and said, "That lady in the carriage wants me to go over to her." The mother could only see her son pointing into thin air, but she was able to hear the sound of hooves stamping on the road. The boy, entirely unfazed, started towards the coach, but his mother grabbed his hand before he could walk into the road. Shortly afterwards, she heard the sound of the coach pulling away and receding into the distance across the River Evenlode. The child was able to give a surprisingly detailed description of what he'd witnessed. There was a green carriage driven by two men in hats, and a woman inside with a black jacket, white blouse, and a hat with feathers in it. She looked upset, as if she'd been crying, and had beckoned the boy into the coach. Her expression had become angry when the boy's mother stopped him from going to her. What, one wonders, would have happened if the boy had not been stopped by his mother? It seems the roads around Finstock have a large number of supernatural phenomena. If we were to follow the phantom coach further down the road, we find local reports of a ghostly white stallion riding towards Ramsden. Is it possible that this is connected in some way to the story just a few miles back? Not far away, another phantom horse and carriage has been seen in Wilcote. If it's the same haunting, then it could be attributed to Sir William and Lady Wilcote, who owned the manor at Wilcote in the 14th century. Like Lord and Lady Tanfield in Burford, they were at odds with the locals during their lives, and have featured in various haunting stories after their deaths. They've been seen riding up and down the avenue in front of Wilcote House in a coach and four. On some occasions it's been spotted flying through the sky above Wilcote and over their graves at North Lee. The ghost of Lord Wilcote was also thought to ring the bell at St. Peter's Church at night, much to the annoyance of nearby villagers. When a courageous rector went to investigate the tower, the ghost told him that he could not rest in his grave as long as the clapper remained in the bell. The rector took prompt action in having the clapper thrown into the local pond, and the haunting ceased. Legend has it, however, just like many other stories involving bodies of water, if the pond ever dries up and the clapper is restored, the ghost will return. Apparently, the pond was actually drained for cleaning at one point, which proved extremely difficult with various strange hindrances. When it was finally completed, there was no clapper to be found, and so the villagers were spared the return of the bell-ringing ghost. In another local story, a ghost taking the form of a black dog haunted the woods at Wilcote. There is no explanation why the ghost of a black dog should roam Wilcote woods. A dark beast, however, is a common phenomenon in Oxfordshire folklore, and we will tell those tales another time. On this occasion, a ritual involving a priest, a newborn baby, and a pair of bird-scaring clappers was performed, and the haunting ended. A short distance to the east stand the remains of the old Roman villa at North Lee, where a phantom Roman chariot has been sighted. A local tradition states that if you visit the villa on a certain day of the year, you can hear many sandaled feet marching in unison up and down the courtyard. Coming southeast through Longbarrow, we make our final detour through Church Hanborough. The 17th century ghost of Jane Skullpepper can be found here, drifting around the old rectory, as well as the old footpath between Church Hanborough and Enstone. Apparently, if you're hoping to meet her, the best month to attempt a visit is April, and if you do, you are in for a shock. An account from two farm labourers remember her to be dripping wet, and rather horrifyingly, only in possession of half her face. It's thought that she met her end drowning in a pond that at the time was in the rectory garden, but whether it was an accident or murder, nobody seems to know. Our tour of Oxfordshire hauntings now concludes in Woodstock. The Bear Hotel behind me in the town centre started as a 13th century coaching inn, so it's no surprise that the building has some haunting stories. Room 16 in particular has been associated with supernatural manifestations. He recounts how a noble woman, pregnant with an illegitimate child, was travelling to Scotland, where her giving birth could be kept a secret and the child could be adopted. Unfortunately, having stopped at the Bear Inn, and while staying in room 16, she gave birth prematurely, and the child was tragically lost. Future guests in the room report hearing the sound of a crying baby, despite no baby staying anywhere in the hotel. A phantom lady has also been spotted drifting down the hotel's corridors, as if searching for her crying child. However, in the 16th century, a woman was strangled in the hotel, and some think that the ghost could be this unfortunate woman. Otherwise, ghostly footsteps have been heard, and some say with absolute conviction that the hotel is haunted by the ghost of a workman who fell from the roof and died over 3 centuries ago. On the edge of the village stands the huge and grandiose Palace of Blenheim, built for John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, over many years from 1705, in the centre of a royal manor and park, given to Marlborough as a reward for his victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim. There was a fine old house on the estate before the palace was built, in which, in the mid-17th century, poltergeist activity was extremely disruptive. The poltergeist was named the Royalist Devil. During the English Civil War in 1649, it was captured by the parliamentarians, who, knowing how much it was valued by the king as a hunting estate, wasted no time in converting Charles's bedroom into a kitchen and the royalist council rooms into a brewery. But it was after they cut down an old tree known as the King's Oak that the onslaught of poltergeist activity began. On a dark night in 1649, an unidentifiable animal was spotted entering the manor, and shortly afterwards, firewood cut from the King's Oak was found all over the house. Over the next 3 weeks, furniture was overturned, beds were disturbed, candles were blown out, and objects were hurled about the place in a flurry of activity. This culminated in the shaking of walls and the smashing of windows, as well as loud, dismal thunderings echoing around the manor. The occupying parliamentarians were so terrified by all of this that they fled the manor for more peaceful lodgings in the town. Whether it was really a ghost, or perhaps the pranks and harassment of locals loyal to the king, we'll never be quite sure. Here ends our ghostly trail of Oxfordshire, from the dreaming spires of Oxford and the bustling market towns of the county, over the hills, down the rivers and lanes of this extraordinary countryside, we've encountered much. Phantom monks, ghostly highwaymen, supernatural stones, and spectral stories of the English Civil War. We hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to bringing you more ghostly trails of other areas soon. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to check the link below for even more ghost stories. Goodbye.
Oh,